Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks, where the Vraxians have received brand new leadership. And quite the leadership change as well. Whether or not it's a good change or not, well, I guess that depends on where you stand. Is a mad apostate cardinal who had locked himself up in his room for years and left the business of running the war to the professionals better? Or do you perhaps prefer a blood-crazed superhuman maniac that has spent the last few hundred years bathing in the blood of innocents? You know, personally I think I'll go for the crazed apostate. At least with him in charge, there was a decent chance of maybe possibly living out the week. Though even with that taken into consideration, it wasn't necessarily an easy choice. Those endless, droning sermons that the Cardinal introduced, oof. Maybe life just simply isn't worth living anymore. But regardless of the preferences of the Vraxian defenders, the war would carry on just the same. As far as the Imperials were concerned, they were utterly oblivious to the drama happening behind the Vraxian lines. Considering the sudden increase in the numbers of inquisitive inquisitors, Imperial intelligence didn't seem to have actually improved much with their arrival. And so, the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army just continued as it had been ordered to. The 30th Line Corps had of course been halted in its attempt to complete the encirclement of the Vraxian citadel, and currently the 1st and 46th Line Corps were pushing in to seize Hill 202 and to destroy any remaining enemy positions outside of the curtain walls, allowing both of the Line Corps to attack the curtain walls themselves in the next phase of offensive operations. The 46th Line Corps was still more or less stuck trying to take Hill 202, but the 1st Line Corps was making considerable gains. And since the enemy's resistance was finally beginning to crumble, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex decided to up the ante. No longer would the 1st Line Corps be allowed to simply move up to the curtain walls and prepare for further offensives. They were now to push onwards until they had either breached the curtain walls or captured the main gate in sector 579459. Until either one of these objectives had been achieved and the 1st Line Corps was through the curtain walls, they would not be allowed to call off their offensive. I imagine that in the 1st Line Corps' command bunkers there was much whooping and celebration for this order, as all of the Death Corps officers present, of course, had heard about the previous attempt at breaching the curtain walls, how many times the Death Corps had been thrown back there, and how steep the casualties had become. And now the 1st Line Corps was expected to do the same thing, but with less support. At least I am sure the commanders were overjoyed to hear that after they had broken through the curtain walls, not before mind you, they would finally be afforded the support of Legio Astorum. If there even was a 1st Line Corps left to support at that point anyways. This new Inquisitor certainly was optimistic, but hey, his optimism had worked out surprisingly well so far, so might as well ride the wave of success whilst it lasts. And luckily for the 1st Line Corps, the Titans of Legio Astorum had finally decided to rejoin the fight, and would now move up to support the 1st Line Corps' efforts to break through the curtain walls. As for the 46th Line Corps, their progress had been considerably more painful. Under inquisitorial orders, the Death Corps engineers had attempted to create a temporary road upon which the Death Corps armoured elements could travel to support the forward forces of the 46th Line Corps. Unfortunately, the construction of this road had taken far longer than expected. It had been continuously bombarded by enemy heavy guns, with observers able to overlook the road directly, and the engineers had been continuously plastered both by heavy artillery and infantry crew-served heavy weapons ensconced within the hill itself. At all times of the day, the Death Corps engineers were under a constant hail of projectiles launched from mortars, heavy bolters, stubbers, and rocket launchers. The first engineer company sent forward to construct the road had been mauled so badly it could no longer continue construction operations. A second company was sent forward, and it too was soon mauled just as badly. A third company was sent forward, and still the roadway was not finished. Meanwhile, the infantry regiments of the 46th Line Corps that had already made it up onto parts of the hill and surrounding the hill were now stationary, pinned down and bracketed by ever more heavy weaponry whilst they awaited tank support that seemingly would never materialize. Eventually, the various Death Corps officers of the companies and the regiments got sick of just dying and decided to die whilst doing something useful instead, and began pushing forward slowly but surely on their own. Fierce hand-to-hand infantry fighting took place all across the hill, with individual squads and platoons pushing forward into bunkers and into the tunnel network in and under Hill 202. The battle was beginning to resemble the same grueling stalemate warfare that had cursed the front line for years. Except, this time there was a significant difference. Before, the Death Corps of Krieg would always have been met with fierce counterattacks whenever they seized a new position or overran a bunker. But now, the counterattacks became sparser and sparser, fewer and further between for every advance they made, until eventually they were beginning to close in on the very summit of Hill 202. The Death Corps commanders were fearing some form of ruse, that the enemy were gathering reserves to attempt to throw them off the hill in one fell swoop, as they had done previously at the first breach. But, nevertheless, they had to carry on. Waiting for the tanks was getting them absolutely nowhere, but if they could kill or capture the enemy's observers on the top of the hill, then maybe the engineers would finally be able to finish their road. The first formation to begin its assault upon the summit was the 15th Company of the 468th Regiment. Having learned previously that to hesitate would only see them pinned down further, the company immediately began their attack upon the summit. It had been severely depleted, however, and failed to carry it the first day, despite making 3 consecutive attempts to storm the top of the hill. But resistance was weakening. The enemy did not appear to be pushing in reinforcements as they had previously in the battle, and the company decided to attempt something rather risky, a nighttime assault upon the summit. During the war, the Death Corps had avoided nighttime operations wherever possible, due to how it complicated communications and maneuvering. It was very difficult to get a formation to its target in an organized fashion at dark, and it was even harder to maneuver in subsequent reinforcements. Additionally, if the first attack was halted or even worse, overrun, far from unusual on the battlefield of Vraks, then the enemy, if they seized upon the initiative, could carry their assault back into the Krieg trenches. And due to the inherent difficulties of accurately observing an enemy's maneuvers at night and communicating accurately with nearby formations, this could quite quickly turn into far more of a problem than it was really worth. The Corps did, however, still have some experience in operating at nighttime, since small-scale raids and skirmishes into the Vraxian trenches were far from unusual. This time they had the advantage of knowing precisely where they were going, and the fact that the enemy themselves had allowed them a bit more to work with. In an attempt at psychological warfare, or as a part of some heretical ritual, the defenders had raised gibbets and other structures on the top of the hill, from which they hung still living Death Corps captives, and allowed them to slowly but surely die from exposure, thirst, and starvation. During the night, to ensure that the Death Corps could still see the grisly spectacles, they had illumination pointed towards them. An interesting decision, but then again, the Vraxians were starting to get desperate. It is also necessary to point out that this was one of the first occasions of this kind of ritualized sacrifice and display of captives in the war on Vraks. A clear sign that the degeneration of the defenders had reached a critical point, where they were willing to risk operational security in the name of showing off their trophies. And so, guided in by the flickering lights illuminating the grisly trophies, the 15th Company made one further attempt upon the summit. And the Vraxians were clearly surprised that the Death Corps were attempting this tactic. They managed to overrun the outer positions, and then slowly but surely pushed into the remaining defensive bunkers. Before the Death Corps had even made it to the rearward positions, however, the Vraxians abandoned their positions and began fleeing down the reverse slope. This kind of panic and disorder on behalf of the defenders had not been seen since the opening years of the war. The last time the enemy had abandoned such a strategic position in such disarray was the fall of Fort A453, the very first breakthrough of the Vraxians' very first defensive line over a decade ago. The 15th Company had paid a heavy toll for its advance, first from being pinned down and continuously bombarded by the enemy defenders, and then, after making 3 attempts upon the summit, they had finally carried it in the 4th nighttime assault. It had, however, cost them virtually all of their officer corps, and only a single junior officer was left to issue the order for the company to dig in and prepare for the seemingly inevitable enemy counterattack. The enemy had never before abandoned a strategic position like this without making substantial attempts to regain the lost ground. But this time, the night continued without further incident. Surely, in the morning then, the Vraxians must be waiting for first light before putting in a solid counterattack. But even as the sun rose on the planet of Vraks for yet another day of hard fighting, the 15th Company could not observe any enemy moves against Hill 202. There was no column of infantry, no rush of mechanized reserves, no armored elements, no nothing. The enemy had abandoned Hill 202, and no attempt to retake it was forthcoming. The company stayed in ready positions for the rest of the day, again expecting what had always followed a major Death Corps breakthrough. And yet, no matter for how long they waited, nothing happened. Eventually, on the night of the next day, the 15th Company got out of their prepared defensive positions and began cutting down the desecrated bodies of their comrades and planting their own banner on the top of Hill 202. And almost in disbelief, the sole remaining junior officer of the company could walk back to the 46th Line Corps headquarters and report that the summit had not only been captured, as per the report of the previous day, but the summit had been held with no further Vraxian activity. And as the junior officer put down the Vox receiver, he looked out upon the curtain walls, and way off in the distance, finally visible from this elevated position, way beyond the curtain walls, stood the final citadel of Vraks, the enemy's last major bastion, and the only remaining major center of resistance. If it could be taken, the war on Vraks would finally come to an end. Back at 46th Line Corps headquarters, the mood was exuberant, and the Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex would immediately be contacted with the good news. The offensive of the 46th Line Corps and the 1st Line Corps had succeeded beyond all expectations, really. At the very least, the expectations of the professional officers. Lord Hector Rex may have his optimism, but virtually never before on Vraks had the Death Corps of Krieg seen such gains for such relatively light losses. The 1st Line Corps offensive had been extraordinarily successful, a success on the level of which had rarely before been seen on Vraks. And as for the 46th Line Corps, its losses on a day-by-day basis were heavy, rivaling those of the Great Offensive, but the battle had lasted nowhere near as long. And whilst many an officer took note of the fact that if their enemy had fought with the same determination that they did during the Great Offensive, the 46th Line Corps would almost certainly have been bled dry at this rate. But the simple fact was, the enemy had not fought like the enemy of the Great Offensive. They had made a serious and determined resistance as long as the Death Corps was held at bay. But the moment the 46th Line Corps' grenadiers and guardsmen made it into their positions, they whittled away and broke with surprising speed. As illustrated by the fact that the command staff of the 46 had received inquiries from forward commanders. They had taken prisoners, something nearly unheard of on Vraks, and they were wondering what they should do with them. There was virtually no doctrine in place or organizational structure with which to take care of the prisoners. The Vraxians fought to the death almost universally, and if they could not fight to the death, they withdraw in calm, organized fashion. Only when pressed to the absolute limit did they ever break and truly flee. But now, the forward companies were taking prisoners by the hundreds, and the siege regiments had no idea what to do with them or where to put them. Neither did the command staff of the 46, to be honest. In the entirety of the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army, there was not so much as a single prisoner camp. Nor had the quartermasters made any plans for feeding prisoners. Previously, on the handful of occasions that prisoners had been taken, they had either been summarily executed or thrown into the labor companies, which were living as de facto prisoners regardless. But now that prisoners were being captured in the hundreds, well, the 46th finally had a reason to be glad for the presence of the Inquisitors in its command center, since its guests were more than happy to take care of virtually any number of prisoners, in one way or another. And as for the big boss Inquisitor himself, Lord Hector Rex must also have been quite relieved. Lord Hector Rex had been around the block once or twice before. He had undoubtedly dealt with a vast quantity of heretics, although we do not know about his record of dealing with an organization the size of the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army, although his recent action suggests his experience must have been fairly limited, as his grand strategy had essentially amounted to throw everything towards the enemy, in the finest example of a certain Lord Commander Jolke, but he too must have been somewhat distraught by the rate of casualties suffered by the 46th Line Corps, and the fact that his cleaning up operation with the 30th Line Corps had been halted so quickly and so comprehensively. For him, it must have appeared as if the 1st Line Corps had, quite literally, saved his bacon. If it was not for their timely intervention, and successful intervention at that, the Vraxians could have continued to pour reinforcements onto Hill 202. And if it hadn't been for the independent decision on behalf of the 1st Line Corps to dispatch one of their siege regiments to shore up the lines of the 30th Line Corps, disaster may very easily have struck the entire army. Clearly, the Emperor was smiling down on Lord Hector Rex, and provided him with the miracle he required to achieve real results on Vraks quickly. With this, surely he would be able to fend off any accusations of wrongdoing or ill preparation that may be leveled against him by the Ordo Hereticus. Or so Lord Hector Rex thought. But it would appear that our good Lord Inquisitor had quite underestimated the industrious nature of the Ordo Hereticus, as very soon he would experience the very same dread that Lord Marshal Arnim Kagori had once experienced, when he had gone through every item on his itinerary and every letter on his desk until there was but one final letter left. Sitting prettily right on top of Lord Hector Rex's massively ornate desk was a small envelope made out of pristine, high-quality paper that virtually radiated malicious intent. And dripped generously onto the center of that letter was a large wax seal bearing the stylized A of the Adeptus Administratum. It really is quite remarkable how much fear, worry, and unease such a simple piece of paper can instill in even the mightiest and most powerful of characters. And sadly, for Lord Hector Rex, ignoring the little white letter would not make it go away. Arslan Kagori had tried that trick as well, and sadly, letters don't simply just burst into flame and disappear, no matter how much you might want them to. And so, the Lord Inquisitor had to open Directive 48877209, issued by the Departamento Munitorum to the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army. That opening must certainly have made the Inquisitor raise one inquisitive eyebrow, because the last time Hector Rex checked, the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army no longer exists. It had been replaced by the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army. And in matters of jurisdiction like this, that was a small but extraordinarily important distinction. The letter began by congratulating the Lord Inquisitor on his achievements on Vraks so far, and in the light of the considerable gains made by the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, the Adeptus Ministorum had moved up their reassessment of the troop allocations to Vraks, and they had decided that since the Inquisitor had things so well in hand, the current level of troops on Vraks was no longer sustainable or required. And since the Adeptus Munitorum knew, of course, that the Lord Inquisitor wished to execute the war on Vraks as effectively as possible, they had taken it upon themselves to recalculate the troops deployed to the Vraxian theatre. And they were confident that, considering the Lord Inquisitor's strategic genius, the loss of a mere dozen or so siege regiments should provide no real impediment to his continued plans to execute the war on Vraks. In fact, it would merely effectivize the process, now that the Inquisitor wouldn't have to worry about all those pesky units wandering around on his pristine battlefield. After all, the ring around the final Vraxian citadel was growing ever tighter, and surely those extra regiments were simply superfluous to requirements. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, however, was of a different opinion. An opinion he made manifest by smashing his desk to splinters. Adeptus Administratum letter still atop it, and began dictating his very own letter to be sent to Terra, addressed to the inquisitorial representative that was currently occupying the seat of one of the High Lords of Terra. In the letter, Lord Hector laid out the situation in exceedingly unflattering and some might even say somewhat venomous terms. He considers this nothing short than direct intervention by the Adeptus Administratum and Departamento Munitorium into inquisitorial business. The 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army no longer existed. It had been fully absorbed into the Ordo Malus, and any attempt on behalf of the Departamento Munitorum to reduce or otherwise hinder the operational capacity of this formation must therefore be viewed as a direct attempt to interfere in the business of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition. It was a letter that was, by no meaning of the word or stretch of the definition, a diplomatic letter. It was barely short of a full-out condemnation of the Munitorum. Whilst, of course, Lord Hector Rex himself knew full well that the idea of reducing the 88s had not originated within the halls of the Munitorum. This letter had the handwriting of the Ordo Hereticus and their ecclesiarchy allies all over it. It was an effort to make Lord Hector look bad by locking him into an endless stalemate on the Vraxian frontier, thereby illustrating his lacking abilities as a leader, opening him up to further criticism from the Ordo Hereticus at the next Scarus Conclave. A conclave that would undoubtedly be called swiftly and conveniently by another Ordo Hereticus operative. And so Lord Hector decided to respond with a warning shot, in the form of his extraordinarily inflammatory letter. He would send a petition to the High Lord, seeking support specifically from the inquisitorial representative, and until he received a response to that petition, he would not give up any of his siege regiments. Hopefully, this would discourage the various elements that were working against him, by saying, "Look, I have the support of the High Lords. You should get out of my way because I have friends in high places indeed." Unfortunately for Lord Hector Rex, even a petition as important as his still had to wait for months before receiving the attention of the High Lords, as that august body deals with petitions from across the entirety of the Imperium. Thousands upon thousands of cases would be streaming in virtually every day, and each and every one would have to be deliberated upon and voted on by the High Lords. This gave Lord Hector's enemies a lot of time to plot, plan, and to prepare. And they had clearly gained access to the Lord Inquisitor's message, because when it finally arrived before the High Lords, they were more than prepared for it. The High Inquisitor's letter was denounced as baseless and unnecessarily inflammatory by the High Master of the Departamento Monitorum, stating that this was a missive penned by a man desperate to retain undue command over the armies of the Imperium of Man, for God Emperor only knows what unspeakable reason. The implications being quite obvious to everyone in the room. And judging by the sagacious nodding heads of the High Lord of the Adeptus Administratum and the High Ecclesiarch, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex had underestimated the political reach of his adversaries, as his emissary found himself on the receiving end of scorching rebukes, both from the Master of the Administratum and the High Ecclesiarch himself. With 3 of the High Lords set firmly against the High Inquisitor's proposal, it was, in reality, as good as dead. An alliance between the Administratum, Monitorum, and Ecclesiarchy was one that could only be overcome with considerable preparation and a great deal of leverage, neither of which Lord Hector Rex possessed. And when the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Lord Militant Solar both abstained from voting, the only 2 reasonable allies that the Lord Inquisitor may have hoped for, the writing was well and truly on the wall. Directive 48877209 would stand, although in a slightly amended form. Clearly, some of the other High Lords had been pulling some strings in the background, and the Lord Inquisitor would be allowed to retain a few more of the regiments originally ordered to retreat from the front. This was a stinging defeat for the High Inquisitor. In one fell swoop, he had lost virtually an entire line corps, as 3 regiments of the 1st Line Corps was withdrawn from the front. The entirety of the 19th Bombardment Corps would also be withdrawn, along with virtually the entirety of the 8th Assault Corps, the High Inquisitor managing to just barely secure the transfer of the 11th Tank Regiment over to the 11th Assault Corps, which would remain on the Vraxian theatre. Additionally, fully half of the independent artillery companies would also be withdrawn from Vraks. All in all, that meant that 1.1 million men would exit the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army, along with 2,000 tanks, 800 Gorgons, and 47,000 pieces of artillery. And worse yet again than the sheer number of troops being withdrawn was the selection of troops. The loss of the 1st Line Corps was a blow, but not necessarily a fatal one. The 88th had plentiful infantry, and even without the 1st, they still retained the 12th Line Corps, the 30th, the 34th, and the 46th. But the loss of fully half of the 88th's tank and artillery formations was a far more severe hit, drastically reducing the firepower, offensive capabilities, and mobility of the entire army. And since his petition to the High Lords had failed, Rex really had no further legal recourse. His only other option would be to refuse to carry out his orders. But that was not really much of an option at all. Especially not since he was painfully aware of who was really behind the order to reduce his army, and especially in such a precise manner. And so he simply stood by and watched the chosen regiments board their super heavy transports and head up into orbit to go, God Emperor only knows where. Nobody saw fit to inform the High Inquisitor of where the regiments were actually headed. And soon thereafter, Rex received a confirmation of sorts that he had chosen correctly when letting the regiments go, as news soon reached the Lord Inquisitor that his emissaries to the High Lords of Terror had all been assassinated, decapitated within their very own staterooms in a particularly brutal and vicious manner, and with an exceedingly sharp blade. The wounds left upon the corpses and gouged in the walls and the furniture of the stateroom could only have come from a phase blade, a weapon exclusively used by the agents of the Officio Assassinorum. And not even the most amateurish 2-bit assassin would ever leave such clear and visible traces behind of his handiwork. Unless, of course, he was specifically instructed to do so. And the warning was no doubt heard loud and clear by Lord Hector, who began reorganizing his remaining troops to finish off the war as quickly as possible, before the various forces arrayed against him could figure out new and interesting ways to fuck him over. And the first piece of rearrangement the Lord Inquisitor had to commit to was who was going to replace the 1st Line Corps. Having the 1st pulled out practically in the middle of their successful offensive was unfortunate, to put it mildly, but their place would be taken by the 12th Line Corps, who would detail the 143rd Siege Regiment to continue attacking in Sector 579-459, where the main gates leading in past the curtain walls was located. It would, however, take weeks upon weeks to move the 12th Line Corps into positions, yet further weeks to rearrange all of the artillery assets on Vraks, and then yet further weeks for the engineering elements to prepare offensive saps, new storage areas, and new artillery lines. It would take so long, in fact, that you're going to have to wait for that until the next episode. But hopefully there will be 2 this week, so you shan't have to wait for too long. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.